2018. The fourth lecture is coming up in a little bit over a month, November 14th. Ben Wilson will be here, and you can find his topic on the back of the card in front of you. And I just wanted to let you know what the date is so that you can think about saving that date for the fourth Trimble lecture of the year. We will also have 4 lectures next year, and a few of them are tentatively lined up, but we have lots of accommodations that need to be made for each of the different speakers. So I'm hoping I'll have all of those things ironed out by the time of the last lecture of the year to let you know what's coming up next year. So I have a few words to say before I introduce tonight's speaker. First, a lot of you have a blue tag on your names, on your name tags, identifying you as donors. We want to thank all of you who are donating money to support the History Center and the Niels Bohr Library and Archives. We count on those gifts to broaden out the things that we can do beyond what AIP is able to support with us. And we welcome increases in donations at any time. This year we have a special opportunity to increase your gift to help us complete the purchase of the winter collection. Those of you who have been here before know of this collection of rare books in the history of physics that we are acquiring. It's actually in the building now, almost 4,000 items in this collection of rare materials, and it's a really important addition to the books and other publications that we have upstairs. But we are not quite yet done with the purchase, and more donations will help us to cross that threshold sooner. On your table, you'll see there are bookmarks, these things, which give you a little more information about how you can donate to help with the collection. Lastly, we are launching an Adopt a Book campaign, the kind of thing that you've probably seen from the Folger Shakespeare Library and from the Dibner collection at the Smithsonian and other places. The Adopt a Book campaign will help to support the preservation and the conservation of rare books in our collections, including especially the ones that are already in the collection previous to the winter collection coming to us. And if you stay tuned, there will be email announcements week or next week on Adopt a Book, and continue to consult our web page for the History Center or for the development program to get more details. Okay, so for tonight, I want to welcome Jimena Canales to give a lecture here on Einstein and his problem with time. And this is carrying on a tradition of having roughly one Einstein talk every 2 years.
Thank you.
So, Jimena lives in Boston, where she's raising her family, and she's writing books and giving talks, and is still very actively involved in the history of science, and is an especially important part of the history of physics community, and part of the history of physics community that is not located in a university department, and not in a history department at that. So welcome, Jimena, and I look forward to your talk.
Great, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. You can hear me well? Yes, yes. Thank you. There's a bit of an echo. Okay. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially now that I hear that it's one Einstein every 2 years. So is that fine? Is the echo okay? No, it's
a delay just in that range. It's really annoying.
Okay, I can do it without a microphone if. Is it gone? No. Okay.
We'll do a test first.
In that.
While we're waiting for the talk to begin,
'Cause-
let me just say that we are live streaming this lecture again tonight. The one last month worked out reasonably well, so we'll hope that this one works out too. If we know we have some people who are already on because this was broadcast on our social media earlier today that the live cast would be taking place. If anyone who's watching on YouTube right now wants to submit a question for the Q&A period, they can send it to me either through the YouTube channel or through Twitter at History Physics, or they can send it to my email address, ggood, G-G-O-O-D, @aip.org. And I'll be watching all three of those during Q&A. Thanks.
Sure. I can use the microphone.
Yeah.
Yep. Is that good?
Take off your...
Just go ahead. Oh, I think. Leave this here. Sounds good. Okay. No. No. Mm-mm.
Don't worry about that. You keep that up.
Just turn it off. And I need to hold it, right? Yes. So today my lecture is titled The Trouble with Einstein's Time, but why I'm really here is because I'd like to explore the broader question of how a book about history and the history of science... Is this better? Okay. So how about a book about history and the history of science can be relevant, if at all, to the physics of today? Is that good? Is that the echo? The volume. The echo. That's so weird. The other microphone is off. I just have an echo. I'm fine. Okay, I'm good. So I have been exploring the history of time. I wrote 2 books about it. And I've wanted to shift the question away from what is time to who has the authority to speak about time. And more importantly, the problems and responsibilities that come with that authority. So today, Einstein's general theory of relativity is still the go-to place for thinking about time. I am hearing me twice or 3 times, but so this will be count as 2 Einstein lectures at the same time. So the way that time was defined in 1905 is still valid and current today. One of the, I'll show you a picture of a Scientific American, and it says, there's a diversity of views, the philosophy of time, building time machines. But if you look right in the second paragraph of the editorial, it says that all these are limited by the insights that come from special theory of relativity and the particular nature of light that is invariant. So light behaves differently from many other things that we know and that we can manipulate at our scale, like falling weights, what Galileo studied, or rulers. And this strange behavior affects the nature of time and space in the universe and gives the universe its shape. All other standards for measuring space and time, such as the meter and the second, are defined by reference to light. And therefore, these standards are warped according to those rules, like a soggy mattress. And some of you have seen this famous picture of the shape of the universe in general relativity. And this notion of time is referred to physicists, connected to what physicists refer to the block universe. And the block universe is a way of understanding the universe in which time is only one additional dimensional to the other dimensions of space, and therefore we have the 4-dimensional universe. And one of Einstein's most famous phrases is usually used to talk about what this universe about. And he wrote this when his good friend Michel Besso died, and it's usually translated by saying people like us, or physicists of faith. The distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. And although it was written in a personal context, it really elucidates how Einstein himself believed that what he found out as a scientist had repercussions for how people in general would think about time, including life and death. And for the most part, as scientists continue to hold this view and to popularize it. One of the most famous ones is now Carlo Rovelli. Closer to me. Pointing towards me, this way. Okay. Sorry, I'm not used to holding the mic. So Carlo Rovelli calls time, a side effect of ignorance, and there are other ways of understanding how Einstein came to this conceptualization, and connected to this becoming the experts on the nature of time is also, as physicists have become experts on the nature of time travel. And one of the things that they usually do in their popularization is to tell us about time travel stories. These days it's mostly around what happens in a black hole, where you can go into the black hole and turn into a spaghetti and then come out of a wormhole. But my question is there a problem with this division of labor, where physicists become the experts on the nature of time and the nature of time travel? And I think an increasing number of scientists think that there is a problem. But what would it be? So one of the most evident reasons is that this way of thinking about time goes against the entire obvious structure of experience. But there is more to that. And here we can go to how Einstein explained to his son when his son asked him why he was so famous. And he said, I was lucky enough to notice what the beetle didn't notice. So a beetle that is confined to a two-dimensional surface does not understand a three-dimensional universe. And he used this explanation quite a bit in other contexts, including his own popularization of the theory. But when, for example, he gave an interview in Chicago, a journalist was very offended by this concept, and this journalist wrote, it began to trickle into his brain, the journalist, that the two-dimensional organism referred to was himself. And far from being the 13th grade mind to comprehend the theory, he was condemned henceforth to be one of the vast majority who live on Main Street and ride in Fords. So there's an immediate disconnect between how ostensibly regular people who are not physicists are similar to that beetle. So let us continue to think about the possible sort of problem. So one of the people who wrote a review of my book was the astrophysicist Adam Frank, and he wondered if, with the provocative question, was Einstein wrong for the NPR blog? And he described the block universe, and he says, in this big four-dimensional space-time representation of the universe, there's Julius Caesar getting stabbed, the Mets are winning 69th World Series, the coffee you're going to spill in your pants at that next meeting on Tuesday is there too. Everything that will happen to you, including your death, is strung across space-time as a linked string of already existing events. So have physicists thrown the proverbial baby out with the bathwater? This is another frequently cited article from Scientific American, a hole at the heart of physics. And this problem is connected to another one, and this that is the idea that philosophy has no role to play in science. And I have here a long set of quotes. Some of them are quite funny. Philosophy is dead by Stephen Hawking. He would say that on many occasions. Philosophers have not kept with the modern developments, particular physics. I'd like to so now Hawking's is dead. Richard Feynman, philosophy science is as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds. Max Tegmark from MIT, talking to philosophers like being caught coming out of a pornographic cinema. Steve Weinberg, one of the very active scientists to write against philosophy. Lawrence Krauss, again, very important, outspoken scientists. A long quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson. I know in talks you're not supposed to use really big quotes, but this is really informative to how we think about these issues in the public sphere. And it's this narrative that philosophers actually had something to say up until the 20th century. You can read it. He said, 20th century philosophers had material contributions to make to the physical sciences. At the time, the philosopher is the would-be scientist, but without a laboratory. So that's the only recent difference you can see. The 1920s come in, we learn about the expanding universe, and we learn about quantum physics, each of which falls so far out of what you can deduce from your armchair that the whole community of philosophers that previously had added materially to the thinking of the physical science is rendered essentially obsolete. And at that point, after the 1950s, Neil deGrasse says, I have yet to see a contribution. So this is a popular science writer, but I trace it back to another important paper in 1967 by the philosopher Hilary Putnam, who was actually my teacher, and he says, I do not believe that there are any longer any philosophical problems about time. He wrote this in 1967. Do you want to pause, or I go on without them? You want the quotes? I can speak loudly. If it's one or the other, I think the visual would be more important. Okay. Okay. I'll pause.
Give me 1 second. Okay. Yeah.
No problem. Is it really bad?
Oh, it's really bad for the people.
For the people. Okay.
You're speaking in a tenth of a second later, amazingly. It comes.
If this was going to happen to anyone, it would happen to the person who wrote the first book.
Thank you for your patience. Okay. Yeah, I can do that. Exactly.
The visual is on a timer. Have to wait for the timer. Visual, right?
That seems to be going. It's probably warming up. On the projector. There.
Okay, it's coming.
Yep. On a lecture on time.
Just exemplifies.
There we go. Thank you. This is the long and you can hear me. Yes. Okay. Am I on microphone or it's just me? It's just my voice? The mic is working. Great. So there's the long quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson with his traditional, widely believed narrative, and the lower one, which is in a serious philosophy journal by a serious, renowned philosopher. So the question that Adam Frank and others have posed, nobody's disputing the marvels of relativity, nobody's disputing the facts of relativity, would all be crazy to do that, but the question is, could Einstein be right about his science and be wrong about the broader context in which we humans put that science? Or is there a philosophy, a metaphysics that goes beyond what the math and the data support? So what we tend to forget is that science very frequently has an implicit philosophical stance, and this one is usually realist, empiricist, reductionist, or mechanistic. And they're so prevalent that they're usually not recognized as being philosophical at all. You also have other ones like instrumentalist, operationalist, or with mathematicians very frequently is Platonic. They might not be acknowledged, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. So the question is, if science has an implicit philosophy that, due to these developments, is believed to be one of non-philosophy. So the French philosopher Henri Bergson, some of you may have heard of him. He was more famous than Einstein was in the beginning, the decades of the early 20th century, and he rose this point when he considered Einstein's theory of relativity. He said that it had an unacknowledged materialistic and Cartesian philosophy. He called Einstein the continuator of Descartes, and as a philosopher, he thought that this philosophical school was deeply flawed, that you ended up with many paradoxes having to do with mind and matter, and the relation of matter to the soul, and other things. So this question can be and is a question of metaphysics. What is the metaphysics attached? But there's also a simpler angle. Metaphysics, generally people are like, well, what are you really talking about? And the simpler angle is, it's a question about the relation of science to social and political authority, in addition to there being a metaphysics. So reviving Bergson's criticism of Einstein got me in quite a bit of hot water, because the usual understanding is that Bergson was wrong about the physics, and therefore he could not say anything. So he fell into the category of the philosophers who could no longer make any contributions in the physics because he did not allegedly understand the physics. And there is something in Bergson that Bergson said, that in what he wrote, that is inaccurately judged according to physics. But his point was never a point about the physics of the relativity, the facts of relativity, or the results. It was always very clear that it was philosophical. So let us go back to open our history books and go back to April 6, 1922, which is a moment when Einstein and Bergson met in person in Paris for a discussion at the Société Française de Philosophie. Einstein had just become a worldwide star in 1919 after his general theory was confirmed by a famous eclipse expedition. And here he goes to Paris, is not invited by the physicist, but he's invited to the philosophers. And in front of him in the audience is the most important philosopher at the time, an eminent figure, older than he, known specifically for what he had said, what he wrote about time, particularly in a book called Creative Evolution in 1907. And Bergson did not want to speak that evening, but he was prodded by the conference organizer, who was expecting a lively meeting. And he said, because Bergson is amongst us, let us have him take the floor. There's a transcript of the meeting, and I was just, as a historian, so blown away when I found the transcript, and so this meeting of these two great minds. And Bergson started with his criticism of relativity, and he said, in my view, we're going to be, the theory of time, my theory of time, we're more Einsteinian than Einstein. Einstein responded in less than a minute. He was very bad at French. He didn't understand much of what was going on. He spoke in French, and he was very bad at speaking. But he responded with one damning and frequently cited sentence: "There is no time of the philosopher. Il n'y a donc pas un temps de philosophe." That night, Einstein wrote a letter to his wife. He said, "All went brilliantly well." He was eagerly preparing his trip back home, holding a not empty leather bag filled with money given to him by the Baron de Rothschild. During his Parisian sojourn, he was able to save, quote, one piece of fine soap and a tube of toothpaste, and he promised in his letter to give it to his wife when he returned. He was shocked to discover that the postage for a single quote cost 17 marks, so he was going to use the post sparingly. In consideration of this, he wrote, "I am not going to write very often." When Einstein returned to Berlin from Germany, inflation was out of control. "If the Germans only knew what services I performed for them here by my visit in Paris, they would thank him," he told her. But he wrote, "No, they're too small-minded to grasp." The debate between the two men escalated quickly. After their first meeting, they were scheduled to meet again in a few months in a different context. Bergson was president for the International Committee of Intellectual Cooperation, one of the most prestigious branches of the League of Nations, and he had invited Einstein as a member. Then the book criticizing Einstein, Duration and Simultaneity, appeared by the beginning of the fall. And here, many of the comments that Bergson said during the debate were elaborated. He said that the philosopher expressed in the preface that it was his duty to defend philosophy from the encroachment of science. He wrote, "The idea that science and philosophy are different disciplines imposes on us the duty to proceed to a confrontation." Bergson chastised relativity for, quote, stopping to be a physics to become a philosophy, and a deeply flawed one at that. Later that fall, Einstein finally found the time to read the book more carefully. He took it with him during his long trip from Marseille to Japan. The day the ship exited the harbor, he started reading. A major racket woke him early in the morning because the crew was scrubbing down the vessel. He jotted some quick notes in his journal. The philosophers constantly dance around the dichotomy, the psychologically real and the physically real, and differ only in their evaluations in this regard. He considered philosophers as cyclically caught between an eternal debate between idealism and materialism, subjectivism and objectivism. And he failed to see how Bergson's entire career had been precisely designed to move beyond those two categories. That winter, Einstein received the Nobel Prize, but it was not given for the theory of relativity. Why? The presenter of the prize said, although most discussions center on his theory of relativity, he was not given the prize because, quote, "it will be no secret that the famous philosopher Bergson in Paris has challenged it." Bergson had shown that relativity, this is the Nobel speech presenter, quote, pertains to epistemology rather than to physics. In response, Einstein proceeded to write a number of letters claiming that Bergson had made a mistake, and this contradicts what he wrote in the journal entry, and also to criticize the League of Nations, of which Bergson was one of the most important members, and at this time was involved in standardization of time and calendar coordination efforts. So exactly the question of how time was going to be defined by physicists. So he wrote a letter to his friend Solovin the following spring, and I'll read it. He said, in the letter he resigned from the Intellectual Committee of Intellectual Cooperation, and he wrote, I resigned from the Commission of the League of Nations, for I no longer have any confidence in this institution. That provoked some animosity, but I am glad that I did it. One must shy away from deceptive undertakings, even when they bear a high-sounding name. Bergson, on his book on the theory of relativity, made some serious blunders. May God forgive him. So in these 4 sentences, he ties God, politics, and relativity together, and as if that was not complicated enough, he dated the letter on a religious holiday, Pentecost, 1923, instead of the calendar. So in my book, I claim that the years that followed their encounter in Paris can be compared to the religious wars between the sciences and the humanities, science and philosophy. But instead of debating how to read the Bible, they were discussing how to read the unfolding of time. So is there any value reviving Bergson for physics, and what did he say? So Bergson believed that determining time was a very complex operation, and that it was absurd to measure time, to define time via clocks. He said, to know what time it is was not simply about reading a number given by an instrument. It was an assessment of the overall meaning of that moment. The broader significance of certain events that made them events explained why clocks worked, why they were fabricated, and why they are bought. These questions did not interest at all Einstein. His mind had no room to explore the reasons why clocks may have been invented in the first place. The contrary was true for Bergson, who wanted to know what led us to live in a clockwork-driven existence, and to figure out how to break away from it. He said, time is for me that which is most real and necessary. It is the necessary condition of action. What am I saying? It is action itself. In the words of the historian Robert Crease, who has written about my book and this debate, he says, that Bergson was not really talking about a different kind of time, so he couldn't be compared. He was talking about a kind of time that makes Einstein's clock time possible, and I believe that is very close to the ambition. So let us take a new perspective for understanding Einstein's contributions, one that also introduces technology into the picture as well as philosophy, and this is again something that concerned Bergson, who in his book wanted students of relativity to go even closer to the formulas of Lorentz, to follow them with pen and pencil, and to figure out what of those formulas attached to the real, and where were that becoming a little blurry and becoming more philosophical and separated from the sensorial and the perception. So we all know that light occupies a very special a very special role in this definition of time. One of my favorite quotes, that quote, but it's from a physicist, Costa de Beauregard, who claimed that one of the main contributions of Einstein's was a technological breakthrough, and this was that it used, and I quote, the wave propagation of light, to use a light wavelength as a length standard and a light period as a time standard. And that was the contribution. So he says relativity enact and makes c, the speed of light, a universal constant by definition. And Einstein himself described in his autobiography that while he was developing his theory, he engaged in what he called a metaphysical sin. And that is that he refined time by reference to an ideal clock based on the speed of light as constant. And that you couldn't have a definition going from the elementary motions of light all the way to time, that he did it backwards. And in Einstein's interpretation, solids needed to be reimagined and re-understood by reference to this new definition. So he, for example, in 1911, he said, if you imagine a rod, he was telling why the old standards of measurement were faulty. If you have a rod or a desk and you push, he said, if we pull on the one side, the other end will move at once. But no, he said, that really does not happen. Why? Because that would be a signal that moves with infinite speed. So everything, even solids, needed to be re-understood in terms of the science of electromagnetic communication. So the first step important for the history of science to reach our current understanding of the behavior of light was when it was measured in the 17th century by old Romer in Paris, and we determined that it had a speed around 300,000 kilometers per second, and that's the reason why, for example, the light from the sun takes about 8 minutes to reach our eyes, and why it's constant. But that insight does not lead you at all to the central discovery of Einstein, that basically is that light is invariant, and that there are no signals that can convey information instantaneously, that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. So why was this important and relevant, again, for redefining our understanding of time in general? So we can see why it was understanding for the science of light, but why did it become important for our understanding of time? So when Einstein published his first paper in 1905, very few people were interested in it, and it was only after World War I that his work was taken up by most physicists. And there are two related reasons for this, and one of them is what I talked about already. It was the wonderful eclipse expedition organized by the astronomer Arthur Eddington, who was very excited about the results that they obtained, and they called up newspapers at the presentation, and Einstein became famous overnight. But why was Eddington so excited about the bending of starlight by the sun? Why was he so excited to organize this expedition in the first place? So one of the reasons why they cared about this is because it showed the immediate need to update scientific thinking to account for the difference between the behavior of light and all other things that propagate in space and time, such as sound, bouncing balls, falling weights, and even bullets. On the battlefields of World War I, the military practice of sound and flash ranging, where these comparisons were made, was used to locate exactly the location of enemy artillery that could not be seen directly. Because of the finite speed of sound, you could have the location of the gun could be determined, and I quote, by a means of system of triangulation. And I will put a quote here from Joseph Ames, the trained man of science in the war, written in 1911, and he describes this system, and he says, this is what physicists can help us do during the war. It says, when a gun ejects its shell in the direction of the enemy, the latter hears in succession 3 sounds. First, due to passing of the shell through the air, in general, a hissing sound. Then the proper sound from the gun mouth, a boom. And finally, the sound of the explosion of the shell. So these expertise showed them how sound, bullet, and light traveled at different speeds. And by figuring out the different speeds, they could prevail or not in war. And light signals, in addition to these other signals, were so important during World War I. This is a painting from Otto Dix, a big critic of the war. He just called his, the painting is known as light signals. So in the context of physicist World War I work, we can understand why so many of the technical as well as popular accounts of relativity during this period and that proliferated after the war used a particular trope to explain the theory, and they called it the flash and bang trope. Now we'll give you some examples of this. And this is a manual from the practice that became first common during World War I, the flash and sound ranging, very similar to the flash and bang. And these are some instruments that are comparing the various speed of sounds through the triangle with the information from the searchlight and using those speeds to figure out where exactly they should aim. So these are some quotes are out of many others that are popularizations of Einstein's theory of relativity. The first one is in the popular astronomy, so journals that ostensibly have nothing to do with war. The other one is from a book about Einstein. And this is how relativity is usually explained to students. That if instead of the sound of a gun being used as a signal on the train, we had fired a bullet, what would happen? And then given a light signal. He goes on, suppose that on a calm day when the train is stationary, we fire a gun from the engine. How this scenario would be different in the case when the train was in motion, if the gun was at the rear of the train. The other is even more specific about what they're comparing light to, that the initial speed of the Bertha shell is approximately 13,000 meters per second. For movement so low, of course, any relativistic contraction is negligible. But this really brings in the importance of noting these slight differences. Much smaller than the shells of European artilleries, but in turn they are launched at infinitely greater initial velocities against which even those of the Bertha compare poorly. Electrons were called projectiles, very, very commonly. Arthur Eddington, who did the expedition and avoided the draft by going on the expedition, he used the example of a rifle bullet to explain relativity and discussed it by reference to what he called the simultaneity of a flash and a bang. And this is probably how some of you learned the theory of relativity. You're in a train, there's a signal, there's a bullet, there's a ball, to point out to the real difference between the Newtonian Galilean physics and the Einsteinian physics. And there's only one author, a woman who wrote a book, Time and Its Importance in Modern Thought. And she surveyed in the book theories of time from the ancients to the present, and she was baffled by why in the present time people were defining time by reference to the speed of light. And she read and she identified what she called the flash and bang trope present in scientific literature, and said, well, yes, okay, I can see how we need to redefine time by reference to light, because, and quote, if we're given a carefully graduated series of examples beginning with the familiar flash and bang and a distant gun, going on 2 guns between which he stands, and ending with a full-blown Einstein and trains and light signals, the reader will admit that it follows from these that the simultaneity, after all, is relative. So these practical wartime lessons end up showing in real life with implications, life and death implications. And they affected something as, quote, philosophical as our understanding of time in general. And it is no coincidence that some of the first and most important physicists to popularize and to work on relativity theory all worked in the signaling corps during World War I. And you'll see names as famous as William and Henry Bragg in the U.S., Trowbridge, Millikan, Mendenhall, the places where these comparisons were being studied, Sandy Hook, the labs, the Palmer Laboratory, and in France, Dubois, Louis Dubois, Maurice Dubois, some of them, again, Paul Langevin, a very close interlocutor with Einstein on these topics. So my point is that after World War I, the realization that no message can travel at speeds faster than light, often associated with Einstein's theory of relativity, was tightly coupled with the development of light-based communication technologies. And after the war, these technologies moved from a military to a civilian context. Commercial applications for long-distance signaling technologies flourished. The relevance of Einstein's light signal-based theory increased in the wider culture as electrodynamic technologies transmitted more and more messages across wider distances. So by the winter of 1920, Einstein had a telephone installed in his Berlin apartment. We don't see those things anymore. He placed it prominently on his desk. The invention of the triode permitted the transmission of radio waves so much that by 1922 it was possible to reach north and south to the poles and even get the waves to Australia. So the Einstein science was necessary for these technologies. In 1923, there was a big earthquake in Japan, and audiences around the world could not wait to receive the news. So the syndicates of the Chicago Tribune and the New York Daily News pioneered a news process that relied on a combination of exactly the examples that Einstein used, vehicles, and to put the footage, and by wire transmission. They sent the footage to Seattle by airplane, and while it was on the runway, they also sent it via the telegraph in code numbered squares of light and dark that was translated on the other end by an artist. In 1924, the colonel of the Army Signal Corps had moved to become chief engineer at AT&T, and he connected 7 broadcasting stations. So you had radio connected by a telephone circuit, and that way he was able to communicate from San Francisco to Havana. That same year, in 1924, AT&T unveiled the 7-league camera, which was the first long-distance printing device. There was a skyscraper in Manhattan on Lower Broadway where an engineer pulled a switch. Simultaneously, 2 cylinders began to turn, one in New York and another one in Cleveland. 270 seconds later, a photographic film of the president and President Coolidge and Mrs. Coolidge was printed 600 miles away. And the following year, AT&T started the first commercial public service for sending photographs by wire. And they charged $50 by a 5x7 transmission and $100 from New York to Chicago and $100 from New York to San Francisco. So new means of combining telegraphs with typewriters, with vehicles and printing presses made the science of electrodynamics relevant for visual culture, mainly newspapers and daily press publications, are not just for theoretical science. So that is the universe, that's Einstein's universe. It's not only away on some distant galaxy, but right here under our noses for everybody to perceive and feel. So during the 1930s, these references to telecommunications media were invoked not only to prove Einstein's point about delay and his focus on the particular status of light, but rather the entire universe was described as a light signaling device. So this is some quotes from the 1930s, and one from Arthur Eddington, where he says, all physical objects are like broadcasting stations that send out signals which we can receive. And the other one, more evocative, light brings us the news of the universe. So what I want to stress is that for light to be able to bring the news of the universe, it first had to bring the news of the world, or it did so only in connection to the news of the world. So commentators, after writing in the decades after World War I, did not have to be working directly with communication technologies to see it on those terms. The first generation did, the second one did it without having this direct experience in war with radio and light signaling. So let me return to my earlier point about the role of philosophy. Why are these mundane links effaced from our understanding of relativity and very frequently science in general? So ironically, one of the scientists who effaced these links was Hans Reichenbach, a close friend of Einstein, a supporter of his, and known as one of the most important thinkers of logical and promoters of logical positivism. And in logical positivism, the understanding of science, general understanding of science, I quote, is that it is a combination of sensorial perception and analytical principles as sources of knowledge. There's no place for experiment, absolutely no place for technology, no place for funding applications, obviously, either. But the big irony is that Reichenbach himself was a radio engineer during the war. He didn't have a job when he came out of the war and started writing about radio, and then attending Einstein's classes on the theory of relativity, and he thought it was the greatest theory ever. And he always downplayed these connections as he moved up the ladder from being a sort of World War I soldier to being a radio engineer to becoming philosopher, ended up in California. And if you look at his book on radio, he very frequently talks about the common practice of taking the speed of light as constant. So the idea that light is the fastest signal, central to the theory of relativity, was originally an elementary lesson in the world of telecommunication before it became seen as a transcendental and universal law of nature. So I want to see if I can make you see this famous light cone from physics, and this is the very common diagram that talks about the path of light through the universe, and it is used in addition, in combination to the general theory of relativity, to talk about the shape of the universe. And you have a moment, a now, in which a light is sent, and it talks about the future is that part where the light can reach. The past is those areas in which you could have had that light signal become a now. And this is a diagram. These other two are the early the first one, the one on the left is from Wikipedia, but the early ones are from the 1920s. They're a light signal. They're discussing a light signal traveling through space and the possibilities of what that can do. In addition to playing down the role of media, the connection of science to war, scientists, technology, setting aside of philosophy, media was pushed out. Scientists' own use of media and as communicators, but also the changing media environment in which they lived, which changed radically during this year. So as I'd like for you to see the light cone as something that is a diagram of the space-time, but also a very elementary diagram about how light can travel. If you can see this portrait and see the microphone as helping constitute Einstein, and Einstein science helping constitute the microphone. So this isn't just a portrait of a man using a tool, but of a changing media transformation. That is one of the reasons why relativity theory became so important. So I'm going to conclude right on time. So my point this evening is not to just show that technology is important or has a role of science. That would be very, very banal at this point, given what historians do. It's also not just to disclose the technological context behind one of the most successful scientific theories ever. It's also not to show the importance of that philosophy is important to science. So what I want to do is to explore a different way of understanding the impact of technology and philosophy on theoretical science and of its importance in general culture. So I'm not talking about scientists' portrayal of their own work, their professional affiliations. Einstein was a theoretical physicist who did not go to World War I. And I'm also not talking about necessarily their direct involvement with technology. It doesn't matter that Einstein was himself not a radio engineer. I'm not talking about funding from engineering, military or industrial sources. That is a way in which the relation between context and technology is usually traced to theoretical science. So what I'm interested is investigating the role played by technologies in shaping rationality more broadly, in a way that includes this division between science and the humanities in which we live in today, for the most part. Changes in our everyday technical landscape affect our individual subjectivities and theoretical science in very subtle, covert, and profound ways. I don't need to have scientists talking about acknowledging these changes. In fact, if they don't, it shows how more profound they are. These changes affect theoretical science not only in the period of its development, but throughout its adoption and subsequent uptake. And many historians of science simply go to 1905 and obsess with that moment as the moment that changed everything. And you're like, well, you have to see what this continues to be important in the longer history. So we can move from a narrow understanding of action, in general, what is action? What can we do and not do? A narrow understanding of our limited sense of responsibility about the world that we live in. And this limited sense of responsibility is often connected to an overblown portrayal of genius, where theories come from seemingly nowhere and are disconnected from their local context, to an inquiry into the role of transformations that affect broader swaths of society and change what rational subjects consider realistic and possible in discursive, ethical, and technical terms. So how the possibilities of action themselves are changed during particular historical period. So we can move from so in contrast to some of the most classical cases that historians have used to study the relation of science to technology and philosophy, I believe that we need to ask additionally how both impact the very core of what we consider to be an autonomous thinking and speaking subject and a moral actor. And this involves not only thinking about subject formation, how are people formed throughout these technologies, but also the formation of rationality. What is it that is rational for us to say at a certain historical period and becomes irrational at a different historical period. So the 20th century closed with the difference between Einstein and Bergson being as vast as that between male and female. And there were many instances in the primary sources in which these differences, Bergson was feminized, he was criticized for having women in his lectures. It also ended with the physical understanding of the nature of time, one physical understanding of the nature of time firmly ensconced. And this scientific achievement, tremendous scientific achievement, dragged with it significant consequences in its wake. Critics decried that certain aspects of time, those connected to life, had been forever lost. Something from Eddington, after he had done all this work, he wrote, "The more perfect the instrument as a measure of time, the more completely does it conceal time's arrow," lamented Eddington. Others denounced scientists for taking conventional standards too evidently tied to contemporary technologies as universal ones, like the ideal clock. Scientists, critics noted, focus too narrowly on measurement and instrumental results, and they forget the very conditions that permitted their measurability in the first place. So Bergson's question of why were clocks made. These debates resonated beyond laboratories and universities, as Einstein and Bergson actively pushed contradictory political and cultural projects in a century marked by escalating violence. So in the words of Bertrand Russell, this is a moment in which you have intellect fighting against instinct. As he wrote this dedicating himself to citing and promoting Einstein over Bergson. Ernst Cassirer said this is a moment where spontaneity confronted receptivity, also siding with Einstein over Bergson. Science, explained the philosopher Martin Heidegger, was now marked by confrontation between lived experience, and the confrontation with lived experience was so stark that it led to a spike in, quote, the irrational as a necessary concept. So the moment that you take away lived experience so far away from science, then the irrational grows. The physicist Percy Bridgman, this one's interesting because again, he's a scientist. He lamented the divide between what he called the universality of science and the everyday, quote, obvious structure of experience. And readers could not help but accuse him of tacitly referring to the debate between Einstein and Bergson. Bergson was very frequently compared to Heraclitus and Ephesus, Einstein to Parmenides. Bergson's philosophy was seen as similar to St. Augustine. Einstein was repeatedly accused of being Aristotelian. So these ancient and modern thinkers were all associated with opposing ways of understanding time, reinforcing dichotomies far vaster than those directly tied to their confrontation. As the century drew to a close, the time of the universe and lived time appeared as irreconcilable as science and philosophy in ways that exceeded the discussion that took place one single day. So my question is, what led Einstein and Bergson to hold such different positions in the first place? Two of the most brilliant minds of the century to not be able to come to an accord. What caused the 20th century to end up as divided and as violent as it did? None of these questions have been asked or answered. the two men and many of their numerous interlocutors took sides. That's what they did. That's what everybody did. Authority for speaking about time shifted considerably during the century in step with major transformations in the hierarchical structure of society, which affected the relative standing of scientists, intellectuals, and the general public in a new mass media culture that divided more and more experts and laymen. A particular understanding of time associated with scientific rationality and expertise gained prominence. Science emerged triumphant, lording over the critical humanities and pushing artistic experimentation further and further away. Time continued to slip by. It cut through individuals who struggled to survive in a world divided into science and art, the public and the personal, the objective and the subjective, the abstract and the concrete. The contradictions that once represented by these two main men gained independent lives of their own, and they appeared as timeless as time itself. Thank you.
Our apologies for the sound problems at the beginning that demonstrate how hard it is to reproduce something that worked perfectly fine the last time we did the experiment. And everything the same. More than that. So, if we now, instead of me using the microphone, I'm just going to stop. If you have a question, just say it loudly enough for you. And Jimena, if you could repeat any questions so that it's heard.
Great, I record it. Yes, thank you. I'll do my best. Yes.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
I think your summary actually made a really interesting point. Well, probably everybody in the room can hear me. I don't know if you need it for folks online. I wanted to actually ask you a question about something a little bit earlier in your talk. I wasn't actually on Facebook or Twitter here. I was actually taking notes. So let's see if I can come up with one concise question here. I was a little surprised at the quote you had of the Nobel Committee about Einstein doing epistemology instead of physics, because I think of physics as epistemology. And I'd kind of like to make the point without falling into the trap, hopefully, of logical positivism, that physics is about coming up with theories that try to capture an explanation of what we know about at any point in time, and that we get into trouble by taking them too ontologically rather than epistemologically. And I think your point about light is actually a case in point, because the idea of the speed of light as a limiting velocity actually isn't fundamental to relativity. The idea of the speed of light as being invariant was implied not by communications, but by Maxwell's theory 50 years earlier, before we knew about communications and whatnot. And Einstein's point was treating that as more important than Newtonian physics, which was being found out from experience, from knowledge. I like to think of it, I like the idea of that a physical theory like relativity implies an ontology. It's when we say that is the ontology that we get into a problem. The idea of there being some limiting velocity has implications on a theory in terms of the relativity of time. If you take that as the ontology, then you get into other problems. If on the other hand, you look at it as an ontology, which happens not to explain our experience, our subjective experience of time well, there's not a conflict. It just doesn't do that, and you just accept it doesn't do that. So my point was, it seems to me that Bergman and Einstein are in a cultural conflict where each is saying, this is the way it is, rather than this is what we know. And I was sort of, you might have seen me, I was sort of taken by your point that the divide was at the end of the 20th century, like the divide between men and women, because that sort of idea of each saying they're right and this is a conflict is a very male way of looking at it. So I would say from your point of view, how do you look at this as rather than ironically take an absolutist viewpoint, how can we take a more relativistic viewpoint of the ontologies here, rather than taking the realist viewpoint that our theory must imply the way it absolutely is, rather than just what we know.
Yes, great summary,
microphone back.
and I agree about what you say, that I thought in the talk that it's about invariance. So you got exactly at the crux of you, and one of the things that most called my attention in analyzing this historical period is that Lorentz and Poincaré, who had already noticed these things about light, about light, had noticed it, not about time. Said, this is wonderful, and you're talking about something about clock coordination, but Einstein isn't time in general. You want to make this into time in general? That's a cosmology. And the criticism, I haven't gone to the archives, I haven't gone, is to the Nobel Prize, but I've read all that has been written about it. And there's criticism by Lorentz directly saying that he's overstepped cosmology to an ontological. And that's precisely what Bridgman also doesn't about Einstein. He proposes a solution that you propose. He said, this is great, but don't call it time. He says, find another word for it. But Einstein during those years was very intent on making his the theory of relativity something that was universal, and then Reichenbach and Kassendak. So this is the entire debate. Well, it started off by definition, and then Einstein in geography. That was my beginning. So this is exactly what's at play. And my solution, I'm a historian. That goes. That I do. Looking back at this, actually be relevant for how we. I'm not a scientist, but there are many scientists who are increasingly uncomfortable with the separation. The obvious experience.
Calculation for the few years ago, I went to read Jackson calculation and the debate around. I was general relativity. There's no doubt understood that was Lyne. I'm not
And Michelson.
a number of things. The Lyne was a long, brilliant
Yes, I mean it's again what you say is true. And Bergson did this in conversation with Lorentz, and he Bergson always said that my theory, said my theory and my interpretation is correct because it's based on yours and yours. Lorentz didn't say that his view of science was based on Bergson. And it's not so much that they did that Bergson didn't accept the physical interpretation of the Lorentz transformations. He did accept, but he didn't give them the relevance. He said, time, there's T1 and there's T2, and they differ. That does not mean that time in general has shrunk or dilated. He did talk about the twin paradox, and repeatedly said, about the twin who goes out on Earth, traveling at speeds close to that of light, and therefore time slows down. He said that's a phantom, and obviously at that time, that experiment was completely a science fiction, and Langevin had thought of it, by reference to Jules Verne. So scientists had no way of proving this, but they did have a way of showing with time coordination that if you send time in one direction, so basically the Michelson-Morley experiment, that the speed of light, that the speed of the rotation of the Earth, which is tremendous, wouldn't affect it. So there was plenty of evidence for the invariance aspect of light, but Poincaré, Lorentz, and Bergson did not see why our everyday general notions of space and time should be completely changed because of that very neat, bewildering, technical discovery or phenomenon.
Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great question. I mean, until my attempt was to not take sides, to analyze both positions as fair and as I could, but nobody had done that. As I said, people just really took very vicious sides up to the science wars in 1996, where again all of continental philosophy and postmodern theory and French theory in academia was associated with Bergson, the rise of irrationality, the narrative that people don't understand, they can't get it, so they shouldn't talk about scientists, so the only people who talk about scientists are scientists themselves, which is echoed in these quotes from Neil deGrasse Tyson. And what I was surprised is that I think that some people still find my gesture or my even-handedness as dangerous and risky, and that I could be potentially again opening up the floodgate of the entrance, the dissolution of the boundaries of science, and the entrance of philosophy and the rationality by reading a book that had been damned, Ration and Simultaneity, like a bad book. Read it like Nietzsche and so I don't know. I'm optimistic. I think that there are a growing number of scientists who see these issues, and I'm hopeful that there can be a third route in which there's renewed dialogue in the discipline, saying, putting this particular aspect of time in a historical context is in no way minimizing or relativizing or doubting the reality, the brilliance of relativity.
Any other? One last question. Thank you. As a engineer,
Thank you. I joke sometimes that I'm very surprised in writing a book about the history of time and just how personal this question is for people. And there is something about the topic that is still about existence and life and death with our time. So I joke that I'm a bit of, people write to me in the middle of the night and say, does time exist or not, or what is it? So I've become the Dr. Ruth of time. But the relation between science fiction and travel is not only interesting, it's important in this debate because it is about the authority of scientists to talk about these questions, and it's about the boundaries of the imagination possible. So Einstein, before, one of the things that he did, he changed the way that we thought about time travel, not only in physics but also in science fiction. So before his theory, most science fiction time travel stories permitted faster than light travelers. And you see these Marion and others in which somebody actually travels faster than the speed of light so they can see the world run in reverse because the light rays of the present still haven't reached them. So there are all these narratives in which you can see Caesar, Abraham, by being in a very distant star and being able to actually travel farther and farther. And Einstein in 1923, right around the time that he was very preoccupied by show that his theory was more than really neat thing about light signals, he wrote a preface to a re-edition of one of these science fiction stories that actually has been a science popularization book by Felix Everty. I wrote it for the New Yorker magazine article. It's been a science popularization, and I said in the book, this cannot happen. And this was 1923 when Einstein was very, very busy. So it is these interventions. Paul Langevin, citing Jules Verne, Bergson, cited H.G. Wells about the four-dimensional universe, and Bergson in particular was very interested in the relation between the science and fictional. So when he talked about the twin paradox, it's also not just a mistake about not understanding or not wanting to accept the physics of time dilation. He was making a point about where the fictional starts entering into the equations and interpretation of particular equation. Yeah.
I kept thinking about a light field.
Mhm.
Talk about fiction. Where do you see that? Or
I haven't read it. Yes. Yeah.
well,